Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Timmy Chow, and I want to welcome everybody to today's panel, which is titled Texas Fighting for Parole Reform and Transformative Advocacy. As I said, my name is Timmy Chow. I am the community outreach lead over at the National Parole Transformation Project, which is a part of the MacArthur Justice Center, based over here in our Chicago office, and we are kind of hosting this discussion today. For those folks who don't know, the National Parole Transformation Project is a coordinated campaign of strategic impact litigation and community-based advocacy directly challenging parole systems feeding mass incarceration. We, like many of the folks, like my folks on this webinar, believe these systems of surveillance and control have expanded unchecked, and that they are functioning to really expand the prison industrial complex by pushing and keeping hundreds and thousands of folks in prisons. As a growing network of advocates, lawyers, and systems impacted individuals, the NPTP develops and supports both local and national efforts to end the expansion of carceral systems and post-conviction supervision across the country. So this is part 3 in a series of virtual teach-ins on parole reform efforts in various states across the country. I'll drop a link later, but our first session was actually highlighting parole issues and advocacy in Mississippi. And our second was connecting with advocates and folks in California doing parole advocacy out west. These conversations look to really illuminate the existing challenges that criminal justice reform advocates are facing and how communities are responding to overcome those challenges. So with that as our kind of context, I'll briefly intro these amazing advocates we have in the room here today. First, I'll say I want to introduce Justin Martinez. Justin is a policy analyst and Bexar County project director at the Texas Center for Justice and Equity. Helen Gaebler was the senior research attorney at the William Wayne Justice Center for Public Interest at the University of Texas School of Law. And Jorge Renaud, National Criminal Justice Director and Director of the Southwest Region at Latino Justice. So let's give a warm thank you to our amazing speakers. And with that, we can go ahead and jump right in and make the most of our time together. So let's start with some big picture and context to give folks just a rough sense and starting point of the actual parole system that we're talking about in Texas. So my first question is for you, Helen. Can you give us a brief, as clear as possible, breakdown of how parole operates in Texas and a bit about how you've seen it transform over time? I know that could be its own conversation, but if you could do us the best you could.
I'll do the best I can here. So hi, everyone. I'm really excited for this conversation. I love to talk parole anytime. I'm here mostly not because of the hat I wear at the Justice Center, but because part of what I do at the law school is I run our pro bono parole project, where we represent women in Central Texas. They're incarcerated in our TCJE facilities. And I work with students who represent the women in their parole review hearings. And so that's been going on. We're in our 6th year this year. And so what I'm going to talk about today is kind of the experiences that we've learned through that project. Parole in Texas, the key things to keep in mind: it is entirely discretionary. Nobody has a right to parole. You are going to serve your entire sentence in Texas, regardless of whether you're paroled or come out on discretionary mandatory supervision or some other form. You will serve the whole sentence. So if you have a life sentence, you will serve your parole for life, unless in very few circumstances you can get released early, but that's very unusual. And the third I want to point out is that the individual who's incarcerated in Texas has no opportunity, except again in a number of kind of unique situations, to ever meet with the parole board. It is all done through third parties. And so they have the right to submit written materials, but no right to actually appear. And so, excuse me, I'm sorry. And so with that in mind, before, just to clarify one point, before 1996, there was something called mandatory supervision, which was when people would be automatically released at a time when their calendar, good time, work time, like when they had reached their max release time, they would come out and they would go on parole for however much time they had left. In 96, that changed to something called discretionary mandatory supervision. And so what that means is that those people now are basically like, it is like, I can't turn my phone off, I'm sorry. It is like parole in every way, right? So even though they are coming out under a different system, discretionary mandatory supervision, the review process, everything else looks exactly like parole. The other thing to keep in mind with Texas, the way it's set up is the board has 21 members, 7 of them are board members that are appointed by the governor. 14 of them are hired or appointed by the board commissioner or by the board chair to act as commissioners on the board. So there's a total of 21 individuals who have the responsibility of reviewing not just all the parole reviews, but they do parole revocation hearings, they do clemency, they do compassionate medical release. We think they have, the last number I had in my head was that they hear about, or they review about 90,000 cases a year for 21 people. So that means we are talking about people who have minutes to spend on a parole review case. These are not in-depth reviews by any stretch. The way it works in practice, there are kind of multiple steps in the process. Once an individual goes into parole review, they will at some point meet with an institutional parole officer who is assigned to the TCJE unit that they sit in. That person does what's called an interview. It is oftentimes 5 minutes. It is not really an interview. These are very short, cursory meetings, really to just check the facts. And those are the facts that TCJE has, right? Like, these are the classes you've taken. Where are you releasing? What's the address? Right, very basic information. The IPO, as they're called, takes that information, takes whatever other information they find in the TCJE records, court records, whatever they have in their file. They create a summary. We never get to see that. We believe that they are the ones who also calculate metric. They go through the TCJE, the board calculation. I'll talk about that in a minute. Once the IPO has completed their summary in that process, it goes to the board itself. Once it pings in the board system, the board will call if there's been a request for an interview. Attorneys really have a right to it. We don't technically have a right, but they always grant attorneys interviews with the board. Family members, not so much. It's quite rare that a family member will be granted a request to speak to the board. And the people who have an automatic right to speak with the board would include victims or victims' families, the DA, anybody on that side of the aisle. So we always put in a request to speak with the board. We are always granted that opportunity. These are not adversarial or like courtroom hearings. There's no evidentiary rules. They are administrative in nature. We meet for about 30 minutes. We do it on Zoom. It is not recorded. We meet with just the lead voter, and then the lead voter will listen to us, take our information into account, and vote. We never see the vote. It votes electronically. It then goes to the second voter in that panel in that office. And so the second voter votes, and if there's a split between those two votes, it goes to the third voter in that office. The way the 21 members of the board, whether they're board members or commissioners, works is they're divided up amongst 7 regional offices. So there's a board member and 2 commissioners in each of the 7 regional offices. And they round robin who's on the panel, who's going to be the lead voter, the second voter, the third voter. So at no time are they in a room together, talking through a case, thinking about the complexities. And what we know is when we've had clients who are denied, it's always on 2 votes. We always get the minute entries from those votes. And we can see that they were voted down once, they were voted down twice, and that was it. They didn't have a third vote. And so that's interesting, I think, in and of itself. Really, there's never a split at the board. And my best guess is that the board, the lead voter, will very closely follow what is the recommendation from the IPO. Remember, they have minutes per case, and so they are just processing these very, very quickly.
Right. Thank you for that, Helen. I'm going to come back to you in a second, but what's sticking out to me, and even just in your brief kind of overview, is just how the stacks are just so clearly stacked against folks up for parole, right? In so many different ways, and also in terms of advocates even trying to support folks, the chips are stacked against you. So with that kind of context, I kind of want to move over to you, Jorge, in terms of, well, one, just more broadly, if you could tell us kind of with that context, tell us just a bit more about who you are and a bit about the kind of specific advocacy that you've done on this issue of parole, right? Because I know you've also intimately, navigated this and have a lot to contribute.
Intimately, yeah. I'm on parole till 2051. I was released in the last time in prison here in Texas in 2008. And I had a 60-year sentence. And like Helen said, in Texas, you do all your sentence, whether it's on the street or whether it's, in a cage. And I did 17 years on it. And whatever, subtract 17 from 60, I do the rest out here. So I've tried to amend some of the parole process here in Texas through the legislature, right? I've filed, some I've passed, some I haven't. I filed a bill trying to deal with what they call blue warrants here in Texas, right? Which a blue warrant is issued against someone who, when the parole officer or the parole office believe that they have done something that warrants a hearing that will decide whether or not they should return to prison, right? On a parole revocation, they'll issue a blue warrant. And a blue warrant, there is no bail, there's no bond, there's no getting out. You go to jail, here in the county jail, and you sit there until they give you a hearing. And I tried to amend that process, and I did amend it slightly, right? To give a judge discretion, right? Whether or not to release someone pending the hearing. I've tried to amend the individuals who sit on the parole board, right? The parole board members themselves. Right now, the only criteria in Texas is they have to be pretty well living and breathing in from Texas. But I mean, actually, they have two. Y'all correct me, Justin. It's one, you have to be a citizen of Texas for 2 years. That's it. And the other is representative of the people of Texas. What the hell that means, I have no idea, right? But that's it. And, there are some states that require people to have at least a bachelor's degree, a master's degree. I think that if you are voting on individuals who maybe a quarter of them have mental health issues, maybe half of them have substance abuse cases, that you should at least have a working knowledge of those. So I filed legislation on that. I try to file legislation where you could limit the numbers of former police officers that you could have on board. That's a hard sell here in Texas, right? I have fought nationwide against what's called the association clause. The association clause says that if Justin went to prison, or if Justin even has a criminal record, and if I went to prison and if I have a criminal record, in some states, and if I'm on parole and if I associate with Justin, in some states will revoke you just for that. Just for that, right? Forget the idea that most people who leave prison are sent to substance abuse, A, whatever, right, CA, and a good percentage of individuals in there are in fact affected by or have a criminal history, right? But the idea that's it's a perversion of a sociological theory based in criminogenic theory, right? That says that says that Justin should not hang out with people, right, who are engaged in antisocial activities. Well, okay, cool, right? But policymakers have perverted that into anybody who has a criminal record must be engaged in criminal activity. So therefore, they will revoke you. The last time I looked, I want to say about 5 years ago, there were 64,000 people sent back to state prisons across the country on parole revocation for technical violations. So anyway, I ended up getting a pretty good working knowledge of parole across the country. And I was working at the Prison Policy Initiative in Massachusetts. And Peter Wagner talked me into, he asked me, what are the best principles that a parole board should have, right? That the parole process should have. I hadn't really thought about it that much because I'm an abolitionist. And my big thing is to do away with it in general. But we went ahead and did that. And some of the things that we asked was that there should exist a process by which someone seeking release can challenge incorrect information on the board. In Texas, you can't challenge anything. You can't look at anything that they use against you. Some states are more lenient, but some states are like Texas. I don't think that prosecutors or survivors of violent crimes should be allowed to weigh in on the parole process. Both of those groups are still living back or are still making decisions back on what happened 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think that supportive testimony should be encouraged. I think that every individual should be eligible for parole. And each state should have presumptive parole. And if y'all aren't sure what presumptive parole is, that's it. The parole board will tell you, you do X, Y, and Z. And if you do that by this date, you will be released on parole. I want to say, y'all correct me, I think there's 3 states that have it. Michigan has it the best, but I want to say Hawaii and Connecticut also do that some. And there may be a few other states that have a working base of that. Parole board members should not use subjective criteria to deny parole. By that, I mean, we're not letting you go because you don't speak English well. That's New Mexico. Texas, of course, and quite a few states will deny you on the seriousness and nature of the offense, which of course you can never change and was taken into account when you were sentenced back whenever you were sentenced. I don't think that any more than a year should elapse between a parole denial and subsequent review. So those are some of the factors that me and Peter decided, and we looked at all the parole systems across the country. I want to say there's 16 states that do not have parole in general at all. And we graded them, and we wrote a pretty good article, and it's in the Prison Policy Initiative. And it is called Grading the Parole Release Systems of All 50 States. It kind of made me a name as an expert in this arena, which I don't think I am. I know a lot more than most people. Yeah. The real experts are the people at the Rubin Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice at the University of Minnesota, and maybe the Executives Transforming Probation and Parole, right? EXIT, which is based out of Columbia Justice Lab.
Jorge, yeah, I will say that our NPTP team, that was one of the first documents we checked out was that survey. Cool. So it's cool to now meet somebody who was part of co-authoring that. Cool. I did, you're a humble guy, but I wanted to throw out there, if you could talk about, I know you were involved with creating a guide. Could you say a bit about that?
Oh, yeah. In most states that you have parole, they recommend that you do what's called a parole packet, right? Mm-hmm. When the board votes on your case, the only thing they have is what's given to them in the prison files, or in maybe pre-trial stuff, right? That follows you around. Most of that stuff is negative, right? I mean, there's nothing in there that maybe explains why you did certain things. There's nothing in there that talks about that shows a holistic view of you, right? Shows a good piece of you. There are parole lawyers out there that I don't recommend folks use, and that's just my personal stuff, right? I think that people should write their own. I know that if I were a parole board member, I would want to hear the voice of the individual who's incarcerated. So I wrote this maybe 64-page guide on how to write a parole packet, right? And there's no official way to do it, right? But there are certain things here that I think the parole board members, want to know, right? Have you educated yourself here in prison? What's your educational history before you came to prison? Same thing with employment. Tell us about your criminal history. What about your substance abuse history? What are your religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, so to speak? And I encourage people to do goal statements, right? First week, first month, first year, stuff like that, so that the parole board can see that you're actually thinking in realistic terms. Yeah. And I like to do a penance statement. I think that again, as an abolitionist, I don't believe in incarceration, but I do believe that we owe penance and some sort of accountability to those that we've harmed. So I encourage that, and yeah, and I give it away. It's on it's on the website here if
Yeah.
someone wants to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jorge. I mean, that's just what a resource you were able to create and share. So thank you for that. I want to kind of now jump over to you, Justin, and maybe if you could zoom us out a little bit and give us a sense of kind of what's happening at the kind of systemic level in terms of some of the challenges you're seeing at that level, and then if you want to speak to any of the kind of ongoing contemporary policy fights that folks are kind of pushing for on this wing. Yeah, would you mind?
Yeah, of course. Um, so maybe to kind of help provide some context, right? So last year, in Texas, there were nearly 122,000 something people caged in prisons all across the state, right? And you had tens of thousands of those go through a highly subjective, dehumanizing sort of parole process that doesn't offer any meaningful opportunity for incarcerated individuals to participate in, right, or have any agency in. You have, you sort of deal with a board that sort of functions and uses its discretion and its power to act more like this, quasi resentencing sort of judicial body that focuses most, if not all of its attention on rehashing and re-examining the details surrounding the sentencing or the crime of conviction and, repunishing that person rather than putting their focus on everything that happens post-sentence, right? On who the person is now in front of you, and at least try and recognize and honor that, growth and transformation happens despite the fact that these folks are in a violent environment and in death-making institutions, right? And so I think, one of the ways that you can kind of sort of really see the systemic and structural issues that are really baked into this process we have here is by looking at, parole denials and parole approval rates, right? So in 2022, we had the parole approval in Texas was 39%, which is awful, right? Because that means that, you have 61%, nearly 38,000 people or so who were denied release, mainly because of subjective standards and on things that the person has no control over, right? And then when you look at our parole guidelines, right, which our parole guidelines here in Texas have 7 different levels, right, 1 through 7. 1 being an individual with, I think it's the poorest probability of success is how they word it, and then to 7, which is an individual with the greatest probability of success, right? And so you can break down that 39% approval rate, and when you look at the recommended approval rates that the board has set for themselves in each of those categories versus the actual approval rate, the board in a lot of cases, I mean, it's underperforming even when it comes to their own standards, right? For example, if you look at those folks who have the greatest probability of success, right? So those who fall in that 7 category, I think the board's approval rate is 65 to 100%. But yet in 2022, I think they only paroled 63% was their actual parole approval rate, right? And arguably, these are the folks that, they shouldn't have a hearing. I mean, they should just be going, you know what I mean? And so, these types of outcomes, right, are what happens when you have a process that is clearly focused more on punishment and retribution, right? When you have a process that, doesn't want to acknowledge that when a person reaches their parole eligibility date, punishment has been met, right? And state, you, right, now have the burden or should have the burden to then demonstrate if you're going to deny parole, that this person represents some type of, clear and articulable threat to public safety that somehow can't be mitigated by either parole supervision or by resources and supports that might be available to that person upon release, right? And I think another way in which you sort of really see the problems with our parole process become even more sort of glaringly clear is how many people who are approved for parole only to have their release delayed, right, due to required programming that the person could not access until they were approved for parole, right? And this isn't like a drop in the bucket, y'all. Like, this isn't just like a handful of people. I mean, last year I think there were like 14,000 people who met, who were able to meet one of the nation's harshest parole approval standards, right? To kind of get to that summit of the mountain. And then here comes the board being like, or get the finish line. Here comes the board being like, oh, you know what? We're going to move this finish line and we need you to complete this class first. And then we'll release you. Mind you, these folks have been incarcerated for years, if not decades. Like, this whole back end rehabilitation stuff just does not make sense at all to me. And this is also something that has, I think, very clear fiscal and human costs associated to this type of practice, right? I mean, if you look on the fiscal costs, I think in Texas, I think just detention costs alone, I think one of the last figures I saw was like $77 per day, right? And I mean, I don't do math, but I would venture to guess that that's not like pocket change, right? Like that's sizable. And more importantly, though, there are real human costs to this. And this was highlighted, I think it was in June 2021, researchers at UT had published this really great report, where part of what they were looking at was at this very issue, right? And one of the shocking things that they found in that report was when they looked at from 2020 to 2021, 42 parole approved people, right? So these are people who were approved for parole, but had their release delayed until they met like a specific date, or upon program completion died, right? I mean, again, these were people who should have been released, right? Who should have been at the very least afforded the dignity to live out their last days with their family and their loved ones in their community, and not dying in a cage. And they also looked at the year prior to like see if this was like a COVID phenomenon. And when they looked at 2019 to 2020, there were 26 people who were parole approved but had their release delayed and then end up dying in prison. And the last thing I wanted to mention was, I think that also highlights a lot of issues, is to talk a little bit about Texas's medically recommended intensive supervision program, which is kind of like our compassionate release law. So besides staffing, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice will say one of the major challenges and issues that it is facing is the rate at which the prison population is graying and getting older, right? That our prisons are essentially becoming nursing homes. And we know this is a major issue. I mean, when you look at like historical population demographic information, you see like from, we looked at 2005 to 2022 and found that those 50 and over grew by 66%. And then when you looked at those 60 and over in that same time period, that grew from 187%. Right. So this is clearly a major issue. And then, last year, there were roughly around 800 incarcerated folks that required 24-hour nursing care. There were hundreds who were bound in wheelchairs, many more who have serious health conditions, including terminal illness. But yet last year, only 58 people were approved for this program. And part of the reason why I think that's happening, part of the reason is that that I think can be applied to the overall parole process and just like criminal legal reform in general, is the deadly and harmful sort of consequences that come from carving out and leaving folks behind. And when you're able to really dig into the MRIS, which we did, and we found in 2018 and 2022, there were like something like 13,000 MRIS referrals that came in. And when we dug into those numbers, we found that with a majority of those, 50% of those referrals of individuals were denied purely because of restrictions and barriers that were particular to their offense, right? And this is also something the system will very clearly say too. There were some great articles that the Texas Tribune did. I think it was in like 2019 or something like that, where they had Dr. Owen Murray had like this really powerful quote in there. And Dr. Murray sort of, I think he's at the University of Texas medical branch, but he's in charge of sort of a large portion of folks who are incarcerated in their healthcare needs and stuff. And he was quoted as saying essentially like, it's not like we don't have a lot of people who meet this clinical criteria, right? It's just that most of them have offenses in which they just won't qualify. They just can't be considered, And so another thing too that I want to point out before I'll sort of be quiet is that, kind of like what we talked about with the amount of people who get approved for parole who get delayed because of programming. When it comes to MRIS, when you look at those who manage to like get through that approval process and who get approved, a large chunk of these folks, 26% of those within that time frame that we looked at, ended up dying before they were released. And I think that's important because I think it goes to show, one, just how violent these systems are really at their very core, right? But I think there are obviously issues within the MRIS process, within the overall parole process, that are creating conditions where people who should be either able to live out whatever time they have left, or people who've met your standard and should be let go, are just simply not. And then you're having these deadly consequences of people literally dying in a cage, So, I mean, I think there's obviously a lot more, right, that we can get into, but I mean, those are some of the things that are kind of near and dear to me. Those are some of the things that we're working on. I think kind of may help, I hope, kind of provide like a nuanced as well as sort of like a general sort of framing of like just how this parole process is in Texas.
Yeah. Well, yes. Thank you, Justin. I think you've just painted such a vivid picture of what, of how this system is actually just utterly failing communities and is getting worse and worse, right? It's being in this catch-all solution to kind of essentially disappearing people in our communities, as opposed to actually having solutions, right? Claiming to be this rehabilitative process or whatever, but it's creating all these kind of levels and layers of bureaucracy of just trapping folks within this kind of complex of incarceration, including the parole system as a part of that. Kind of building off of that and pivoting just a bit, I want to come back to you, Helen, in terms of what it means to be an advocate in that context, right? In that context of navigating a system that is designed to fail people, right? And trap folks. Can you speak to some of the advocacy, the direct advocacy, and legal advocacy that you're working, what it means to do a transformative approach to that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to circle back a little bit and just say, I think so much of what Jorge and Justin have talked about goes to this idea that, I mean, the board, let alone the people of Texas or the DAs and the I mean, they don't understand what parole is, and they don't understand why we have it. Or maybe they understand it and just don't like it. But what we find very frustrating is when in representing, and we represent only women and only in Central Texas, so we're only in front of the Austin and the Gatesville boards, but their offenses are from all over the state. And what's very frustrating is running into instances where we have seen women undergo unbelievable transformation and done incredible amounts of meaningful, hard work in confronting their own lives, and yet it is completely disregarded by the board as being important because there is a victim or an objector involved, right? And they say, well, the community, we have to sort of the community standards, it's going to be, and as Justin pointed out, sort of so much of the scoring is static. And so for these individuals, regardless of how much work and transformation they've gone through, they are going to keep popping up with the same scores over and over and over. Those scores don't change. And they punish people for the very specific things that we know should not be considered. For example, the age at the time of your offense, and if you've been involved in the juvenile system, counts against you in that scoring. And we know that in many states and many jurisdictions, that is now recognized as factors that actually should be in their favor in terms of helping them find new ways forward, that youth shouldn't be counted against them. And so our system is so completely broken in terms of how it it takes into account the reality of people's lives and the reality of the trauma. I mean, all of our clients have been through a lifetime of trauma, and almost without exception. And I can only think that's true for the men as well who are incarcerated. That it just, there's no way to get that front and forward when we are stuck with these systems where the supposedly, objective criteria that's being considered really doesn't allow for any of this growth and development. What we find with our clients is that, and I tell our students this every time, and we have about 60 students working on these cases, and they want to get the person approved, and and it's always hard to say, well, I think the likelihood in this instance, for all the reasons that have been discussed, it's going to be hard, and to help them understand that the work they're doing is important nonetheless. And I think the cards and the letters we get from our clients after we have represented them, regardless of the outcome, shows the extent to which we work with them for the whole year, the academic year that the students are involved, that these women have all pled. None of them have ever had almost none have ever gone to trial. They've never told their story. They've never been able to really process the whole context of their life and the connection with the offense for which they're incarcerated. And so I think part of what we can do for our clients in the representation is help empower them to tell their story and to understand the context and the background to what is happening to them. Help empower them to be stronger advocates and self-advocate on their own behalf around what they need to be successful kind of going forward and trying to have a successful journey home. And they're just incredibly grateful for having been listened to and believed and given a voice in the process, because the system does not give them a meaningful avenue to really be heard. And so, for all those reasons, one of the things I wanted to say earlier is I really see there's 3 levers when individuals can have real impact in their case here. One is when they're talking to the institutional parole officer and what goes into that summary. The second is the packet that goes to the board. If the family has put together a packet, or if they've submitted letters, whether it's in a packet or just individual letters and certificates. And the third is the opportunity to appear in front of the board. I think for us as lawyers, being able to appear in front of the board is by far the most impactful piece we can have. We get 30 minutes of their undivided attention, and I think that makes all the difference in the world. But very few people have a right to that, or will have an opportunity for that hearing because of the way parole is structured. And so I really push very hard on our clients. And when I have people, we have many, many people seeking assistance who we cannot help. We just are at capacity. We get 30 letters a month of people asking for help, just from women. And I really try. We recommend Jorge's packet and talk about how they can self-advocate at the IPO level, and really try to bring some of their story to the IPO and really try to get some of that into that summary, so that the IPO will adjust their thinking around how to interpret this, if there's a stack of criminal records, or if there's a whole pile of disciplinary record, like they gives them more information to understand that other material that they have. And the hope is that they will put some of that humanity into their summary. And the board, I don't think the board is completely immune to the humanity piece, but they don't hear it. They don't see it. It's not brought to their attention.
Helen, I think I really appreciate, especially for this conversation, for advocates, other attorneys, and folks representing and supporting folks. What I really appreciate is, in spite of this massively complex system, was a parole system which is designed to take away folks' agency. I appreciate, and I think it's really important, what you've shared is a reminder of when we're doing advocacy, whether it's as advocates, allies, what have you, is finding ways to make sure that that folks' agency and humanity is also centered throughout that process, right? We're not losing sight of that. Kind of on that note, I'm going to pitch it back to you both, Justin and Jorge. You can tag team this if you want. But just thinking, again, about like what needs to change, right? And what are some of the strategic opportunities that y'all are seeing around, around the issue of parole and reforming parole in the state. Yeah.
If I can go first, Justin, because I'm going to leave basically that one to you. Because I don't think we can change the parole board enough in the state or whatever to make it worth whatever. I just don't. And I think one of the things that I don't think neither Justin or Helen have spoken to is that you can have three people with pretty well the same exact history, the same accomplishments while they're in prison, the same charge. One goes, one doesn't, and maybe the other one doesn't go, but is given like a 5-year set off, and one's given a 1 year, and there's no rationale behind it, none whatsoever. So having said that, I have people ask me, how do I help my son make parole? You don't, you can't. You could help him or her or whatever individual you have incarcerated prepare themselves, use self-insight and look at maybe personal deficiencies or whatever they have, or whatever maybe brought them there, right? Like Helen was to improve yourself, focus on yourself. Eventually they're going to let you go, and the thing is not to come back. But trying to persuade, trying to figure out what it is that this group of individuals wants from you, when the person down the run has the same charge as you, went home three hearings ago, you've been denied 3 times, and the same charge, the same history, right? There's no rhyme or reason to it, and all it does is drive you crazy. It makes you focus on things that maybe aren't going to help you when you get out, right? And I have a hard time persuading people of that, unfortunately. But I'll throw my case at it. I did 16 and a half years the last time on a 60, an aggravated 60 for aggravated robbery. It was my 3rd time in prison. I thought I was going to die in prison. They let me go after 16 and a half years, and there's no, people have a theory that the board just kicked me out because they got time to deal with me, in prison, some of the stuff I was doing, I don't know. But yeah, anyway, that's what I want to focus on. Justin, you want to go and talk about policy stuff, how to change, because
Yeah, I mean, that the policy, I have been having a hard time with the policy side of things, because I wish we weren't having this conversation, because I don't wish that we were doing and kept putting all our resources into this system, right? We don't need to have people caged, period, right? That's what I believe. And so because of that, I'm always someone, when I hear someone come up with like some reform that's going to make the process more effective, or I roll my eyes and I'm like, that's not where I want to spend my time at, like I want to spend my time at figuring out how we can get rid of these systems. And so, when it comes to parole, right, I mean, it's what we have, it's what we have. And unfortunately, today we have people who need to be home, every single one of them, right? And I feel like because I've chosen to work in this arena, I need to deal with the contradictions that come with that. And that's just life and all that, right? But I think when we're talking about parole, one of the things that I want to see is, I do want to see parole flipped on its head. I do want to see presumption of parole. Now, I think we have to be very careful about how we go about that, because as Jorge kind of alluded to, presumptive parole is not new. States, like New Jersey's had it, I think, since the 70s or whatever, and they are having problems with it. California has presumptive parole, and they are having problems, right? And I think it comes to, one, the system is functioning exactly the way it was meant to, and will, because that's just what's baked into it. But when you have discretion, I found any time where there is discretion in anything, it can totally undermine sort of the intent of what you're trying to do, right? So as someone who is working in this arena, I mean, what I am and would love to see and work with folks is how can we build out a presumptive parole release in Texas? How can we deal with the way in which the parole board goes about making its determinations, right? You know, in a way where like it's just complicated. It's just you know, it's a complicated thing to do, especially here in Texas. And I know the first go around, even if we were to get that, is probably going to be some weak, watered down, you know, version. But I'm hoping that it will at least maybe create the conditions in which maybe we can build off of. I also think I also think people like me need to stop looking at the ledge as the solution to everything, y'all. Like we need to get out of that place and we need to move on to other things, right? The ledge is part of it. Policy and legal solutions are part of it, right? But we need to be thinking about like what else can we do to like help support these people and move this world we're living in now closer to where we want to be, right? And that's instead of dealing with the lawmakers and the policy, like we need to be making critical connections with folks like us and people in who are watching this and other folks who are doing this work on the ground. You know what I mean? And doing a bottom-up approach as opposed to this top-down sort of traditional organizing that tends to happen. You know what I mean? So, you know, those I don't have answers to much of that. But those are like the things that like I sometimes stay up at night trying to figure out like how to do this.
I'm feeling motivated and fired up just from what you shared, Justin, because I think what I'm hearing too, and what was also a theme in the California panel was how any elements of discretion, whenever that's built in, it's gonna be subjected to bias and all of the kind of cultural and political norms of the current environment, right? Which then we know is, you know, what makes legislation possible, even what makes reforms possible, is also the kind of broader political context and environment that y'all are sitting and swimming in, right? So then that speaks to like the necessity of like being able to kind of change both through apply much pressure to even just the like ideas around crime and the logics that are kind of grounding all of these things to begin with. Helen, I know you wanted to follow up on this piece.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, so one of the thoughts that folks have kicked around is the idea of maybe not calling it presumptive parole, but calling something like administrative parole, right? So it is the streamlining of the paperwork. It is the streamlining of the board's responsibilities. And so, you know, it is an automatic release unless, and the unless is a very clear unless. It's not unless the board determines that they don't think you're safe, but it's unless there's been a major disciplinary infraction 6 months prior to, or unless, right, you know, they haven't completed whatever the one required thing is on their ITP, their treatment program. Like it could be kind of something that is very objective and could be tracked. And it may just, I suppose, create other problems elsewhere. But I mean, we don't want people to be picking up major disciplinary infractions within 6 months of their date if people know that they're coming up. You know, but in any case, I think there are ways to do it that could potentially, I mean, if we did administrative parole for some sort of a streamlined parole for people who are 5, 6, or 7, which are the 3 least considered the most safe, least risky, right? It's half of the people who come up for parole. And as I think Justin had said, we're not even close to hitting those, the proposed rates. I mean, for 7s, for somebody who's ranked 7, these are people who it's up to 100%. We should be releasing all of these people, and we're releasing a fraction. And so I do think there's a way that we could at least get a lot of people out of the review process pretty quickly if we could find some way to understand what like a streamlined process could look like. The other piece that I think is really important is that there is no knowledge about the system. People don't understand the system inside, and people don't understand the system who are outside. And I think when I talk to the students about doing these cases, they are horrified to hear how the system works. I mean, or doesn't work. It doesn't fit any of their expectations or understanding of what's supposed to be happening in a parole proceeding. And so I think that having general education, really getting into the public and educating the legislators about the realities, educating the public about the realities of how this works, and showing them how successful people are when they come out if they are given adequate support and meaningful opportunities to succeed. The fears are just unfounded. And so those are the two things that I think really need to happen.
Thank you for that, Helen. Wow, I'm surprised at how quick time flew by. We're 5 minutes out of the hour, but I wanted to give a chance to all of our panelists. If you had any like final comments or reflections you wanted to share on this piece around looking forward, right? We've heard a lot about the need for possible ideas for how it could be shaped, reformed to get as many folks out as possible, right? But did y'all want to share any kind of final comments before we close this convo out?
Yeah, I'll go. I mean, I throw this out there more as an invitation. This is, incarceration is not necessarily my where I experience the system, but I have a lot of folks who I love and care and who I consider my chosen family that have gone through this. And so this is extremely important to me. And I just, I would love to connect with as many folks as I can who may be on here or who may be watching in the future. Because I think we really do. I mean, we are, we're living in apocalyptic times. Like, I don't think that's an overstatement. And I think we need to figure out how we can build relationships with each other and connections. Because I feel like part of the issue is we silo ourselves so much. And we also don't know how to deal with conflict, but that's a whole nother panel. So I would just please an invitation to anyone who wants to just chat and talk about parole or what they may be doing or things that they're, having issues with and challenges with, and hopefully we can maybe sort of create a space in which, maybe we can be real intentional about that and bring folks in to do that. But yeah.
Amazing. Yes, and I think that's been a vision for the National Parole Transformation Project, is a convener of that exact space that you're talking about, Justin. And so, yeah, we will send a follow-up to all folks registered in terms of to share a recording of this. We'll also be turning this into a written transcript that can also be sent around and also shared and mailed with folks, any of our Texas networks inside, to get to this piece about education, right? I know Robert actually sent a specific question around how we can share that knowledge. And I also want to let folks know that we are actually going to do a part 2 to this conversation in Texas, featuring folks here, but also in conversation with a couple additional advocates, and dive a little deeper into this piece around advocacy and mobilization and applying pressure. So be on the lookout for that. I would love if folks want to go ahead and you still with us, throw some thank yous to our amazing panelists. I mean, I've learned we've already had conversations, but I've also learned so much just from this one. So big appreciations to our panelists for breaking this down for us. We for folks who don't know, you can find the recording once it's up at our playlist. It's a YouTube playlist where we're kind of compiling all of these teach-ins state by state, right? And so that's where you can go find other teach-ins. But yeah, thank you everybody so much for tuning in. Thank you to our panelists, and yes.